I'm grateful for your faithful advocacy for justice and peace, for the interfaith character of Texas Impact. I know you have a long history behind you. I did not realize that Texas Impact was established in response to the Sharpstown scandal many years ago. I read up a little bit about that stock fraud incident, and I realized that much of our public policy advocacy in Washington, in Austin, and elsewhere is about insisting on good government. As noted in your statement, that Texas Impact was founded on the central religious conviction that religious communities are called to minister to the whole person, to respond with compassion to the physical, emotional, and spiritual needs of all people. Of course, the search for good government is such that we'll never be out of business as Texas Impact or as the National Council of Churches. You may recall the legendary Louisiana politician Huey Long, also known as the Kingfish, who was active during the Great Depression years. After his assassination in 1935, though, his brother Earl continued on and was governor and congressman from Louisiana. And one time he said, someday Louisiana is going to get good government and they ain't going to like it. So, as I said, I feel like we have a constant struggle to push for open government, for morality in government, for ethics in government, but that's part of what we do. And that's really, I think, one of the key reasons that we're here tonight. Before I go any further, I'm going to ask my colleague Christian Watkins to cue up a brief commercial that we have created about the National Council of Churches. Christian?
The National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA, a faithful witness to the living Christ in the public square since 1950, representing 38 Christian denominations, advocating for and representing God's love, justice, and peace in our nation, working with interfaith and secular partners on an agenda of ending racism and fostering prophetic transformation from Washington, D.C., translating the NRSV Bible, promoting Christian education and spiritual formation, and convening table interfaith dialogues. The National Council of Churches, many standing in solidarity for justice and peace as one.
That was great. Thank you. It was my first time to see that. I really appreciate it, Christian. The National Council of Churches, as Whit mentioned, is comprised of 38 member communions or denominations with about 100,000 local churches in total and some 30 million church members. The National Council of Churches includes historic Black denominations, Baptist and Methodist, 9 Orthodox churches, such as the Greek Orthodox Church, the Armenian Orthodox Church, and others, the mainline churches, as we call them, and peace churches, including the Brethren and the Quakers. So quite a few of those who participate in Texas Impact are also part of the National Council of Churches. And we stay in touch not only with Texas Impact, but with state council churches all around the country. And we're in regular contact with World Council of Churches and other councils of churches, particularly in Canada, Cuba, and South Korea. We, as was also mentioned, we own the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, and we are right now undertaking an update of the NRSV, which will be complete next year. We carry out formal interreligious dialogues with Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh partners. We publish the International Sunday School lessons. We carry on faith and order work and conversations exploring our theological and doctrinal differences. We're very involved in justice and advocacy efforts. We host an annual Christian Unity gathering each fall, and we're part of Ecumenical Advocacy Days, which will actually take place next month. Our major focus in recent years at the National Council of Churches has been our Act Now initiative to end racism. I began leading the National Council of Churches in 2014. A few months later was the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson. It seemed like just a few months after that was the massacre of church members at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, and we really pivoted and we have a long-term focus on ending racism. I know you're involved in meetings with the Texas legislature right about now. Similarly, we've been in regular meetings with the Biden-Harris administration and with members of Congress on, it seems like every issue you can imagine, including COVID relief legislation, which looks like it's finally about to pass Congress. We've been in contact with them regarding the vaccine distribution, about sanctions on Iran and Cuba and Korea, about criminal justice and mass incarceration, on voting rights, on reparations, and a variety of other matters. And in a few minutes, Christian will discuss in further detail our 2021 legislative priorities. We go about doing this through a variety of coalitions here in Washington. Probably the most central to our work is what we call the Washington Interreligious Staff Council, which once upon a time was really the mainline Protestant churches and a few others, but now includes the entire interfaith community. Christian, for example, represents us on the Domestic Human Needs Working Group. We have working groups on healthcare, on drones, on poverty, on environmental justice, and on and on and on. It's a very well organized community that we're part of. But you'll see on the screen there, that's just one of many coalitions we're part of. And what you see there is not a comprehensive list, but some of those that are very important to us include the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition, the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, the Circle of Protection, Shoulder to Shoulder, and the National Religious Coalition Against Torture. As I think back on the past, my father served local United Methodist, Disciples of Christ, and American Baptist churches in Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Illinois for about 60 years. Our life as a family was wrapped up in all those churches. I was in Sunday school and Methodist Youth Fellowship and summer mission trips. In one of the churches, the trustees paid me $1 every night to lock up after all of the meetings were over. Although my dad was a Protestant preacher, he was influenced by Catholic social teachings, which assert three principles in particular. First, the needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich. Secondly, the freedom of the dominated takes priority over the liberty of the powerful. And third, the participation of marginalized groups takes priority over the preservation of an order that excludes them. Many years ago in a sermon, my dad said, "For too long, housebroken congregations have been spoon-fed spiritual pablum by pet preachers who tell nice little stories derived from the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son. We all know how sweet and kind Jesus was and that God will forgive everything we do because, well, that's just the way God is and what God does best. But the word of God came to Moses on Mount Sinai, the holy mountain of God, in a way that shook the earth. Here we are living in the midst of a pandemic in which millions have died around the world at a time when climate change threatens our very future, and while systemic racism plagues our society, and the gap between the rich and the poor widens daily. This is not a time for people of faith to remain silent. Now, as we go about this advocacy, we all know that we don't try to control the state or the government. We sure don't want the government or the state to control the church or any other house of worship. But we do have the responsibility to speak truth to the state. I've heard members of Congress express thanks, not only to the National Council of Churches, but to the entire faith community, because when we meet with them, we're not asking for some special favor or law that benefits our churches or houses of worship over and against others. We're there, and I think this is what earns us credibility in the halls of power. We're there not for ourselves, but on behalf of the last, the least, and the lost. That's our calling. We bring a dose of reality to the work of the Texas legislature and to that of the U.S. Congress. You all are living into what it means to be an interfaith organization. And we too are working in interfaith coalitions every day. Right now, for example, we're part of a brand new effort called Faith for Vaccines, made up primarily of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim groups, seeking to connect our synagogues, churches, and mosques with health departments across the country at the state and local level, so they can be used as vaccine distribution sites. Over these next few months, tens of millions of Americans, maybe even hundreds of millions, are going to receive the vaccine. And not all of those are going to be distributed through major stadiums and arenas or through CVS's and Walgreens. And our houses of worship are trusted community sites that can be used to defeat this pandemic. That's putting faith into action. But that also requires us to be in touch with the government all the time. I'm well aware that there are a lot of groups, a lot of people who don't want groups like Texas Impact or the National Council of Churches to speak to public policy issues, who would prefer that churches keep silent about what's happening in the world. There's probably nothing I can say to convince them otherwise. I do believe, though, that silence means consent in the face of injustice. We don't endorse political candidates or parties. We don't fund political campaigns. We raise our voice in a thoroughly appropriate way to speak truth to power. I don't believe the God who heard the cries of people living in slavery in Egypt and who led them to freedom wants us to remain silent as the storms of life are raging, in the midst of tribulation, in the midst of faults and failures, in the midst of persecution, if I may paraphrase Charles Albert Tindley. We are all about hope. Hope is lived out in practice. Hope forestalls despair. I thank you for letting me share thoughts with you tonight, and I'm happy now to ask my colleague, Minister Christian Watkins, to update you all in particular on some of our 2021 priorities.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Jim. And I think I just fell in love with my job a little bit more after hearing the justifications, the theological justifications for this work. Of course, we in this work called Justice Advocacy, we all come up with we all have our own definitions, our own theological understandings of what it means and why we make justice happen, as Micah 6:8 calls on us to. But after hearing that, I just got a little bit more energy to run on and see what the end is going to be. And Whitney, thank you very much for your introduction. I would add to it that I graduated in 2019 from Perkins School of Theology with my Master of Divinity. So that is also what propelled me further deeper into this theological advocacy realm here in DC. And I'm grateful to be a part of the National Council of Churches as a Justice and Advocacy Outreach Manager, and working with the interfaith coalitions and the secular organizations to make this thing called justice happen here in Washington, DC. But now I would like to share with you another PowerPoint, or another part of the PowerPoint, if you will, where I will show our 2021 priorities. On Friday, December 11th of 2020, the National Council of Churches board met with the Biden-Harris transition team, and we delivered a letter to them outlining our priorities and the policy asks that we wanted them to adhere to. So that, and that is what I'm going to outline for you all right now. The Anti-Racism Act Now campaign, to where we awaken, confront, and transform persons through various anti-racist trainings and diversity trainings, and through our national advocacy and conversations and convening table conversations, where we motivate persons to awaken, confront, and transform themselves out of the racist tendencies into an anti-racist mindset, to where anti-racism is the primary lens, is one of the primary lenses in which we operate, as well as form legislation. And through that, we've been advocating for policies like HR 40, the reparations, the bill to enact a study to study reparations and the historical trauma and conditions that have been created under slavery. And then we also participate, as Jim mentioned earlier, that I represent National Council of Churches with the Domestic Human Needs Working Group of the WISC community, the Washington Interfaith Staff Community. And we are working together to analyze policy through the lens of anti-racism on hunger needs and criminal justice reform needs, that kind of thing. We also, the legal system reform is one of our high priorities, where we are concentrating on ending mass incarceration and solitary confinement, ending capital punishment, because capital punishment is a hindrance of the transformative work that is available to all of us, the reconciliation work that's available to all of us just by virtue of the cross. If Jesus, think of what would happen if capital punishment was not allowed to happen with Christ. Would we be redeemed today? But conversely, now, since we are redeemed, we have to believe that God's work is continuing. God's work is ongoing. So all life is valuable, and none of it deserves to be snuffed out before God's given time. So with that theological understanding, we go ahead and dig deeper into legal system reforms that inhibit the flourishing of lives. And then we go on to international justice and peace efforts, anti-war efforts, that since Martin Luther King and his coalition of pastors were part of NCC here in DC, and working through the Poor People's Campaign, and also the original Poor People's Campaign, and through the anti-war efforts, National Council of Churches is faithful to continuing that work, and through advocacy about improving human relations and removing economic blockades and sanctions, crying for justice, or decrying justice for Armenia and the ongoing Israel and Palestine conflicts, and so on. And then so back to the domestic human needs, that is also in conjunction with our COVID response advocacy, ending poverty and hunger on the childhood and adult levels. Because no one deserves to starve. And with America being the world leader that it is, and with 40% of the population, that's roughly 132 million people are one check away from being in poverty. That's atrocious for this nation, for this rich nation, to have that many people in poverty or on the brink of being in poverty. And with the onset of COVID, when the housing moratoriums expire, think of how many more people will be homeless. I think someone said it was going to be a 50% or 40% jump across the country. So why not advocate for them, for the least of them, who are struggling in this COVID pandemic now, and even those that were struggling before. So that drives our advocacy here in Capitol Hill. And then immigration reform. Now we partner with the Church World Service, because Church World Service used to be a part of National Council of Churches, but they lead the way in our international and immigration reform efforts, and we partner with them. They're one of that DC coalition that we work with on a regular basis. So that is the end of my presentation. That's a highlight, a high view of our priorities. If you want to find out more, please do go to our National Council of Churches website to sign up, to investigate what more we've done, all the statements that we've issued, all the notes and whatnot from different meetings have been placed on our website through press statements and whatnot. You can also sign up for updates to keep informed of what we're doing here in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the church. So if you could, I'll pass it back to Whitney, and thank you for this opportunity.